Good evening, everyone. As you guys can tell, Pastor's taking a break, a well-deserved break. So you guys are stuck with me again tonight. And thank you for everyone online joining us. And we're going to continue our study in Genesis. And we left off last week in the middle of chapter 12. But going back to, Pastor covered it, and we're just going through the steps of what occurred. And one of the things I shared last time was that biblically, when we understand what the Bible is, that it's a linear process, right? There is no connect the dots. There's nothing like that. It's actually from beginning to end. So we started with creation, and we understood where Jesus was involved in all aspects of creation. Actually, the Trinity was involved, what we understand the Trinity to be. And he played an active role, and that's why we titled it Jesus in Genesis. I'm staring at my wife because she was supposed to be here, so everyone look at her and embarrass her, please. So, maybe you get the camera on her too, guys. Sorry, that was a cheap shot on her, but... So we started with creation. And then we found out about the fall, right, with Adam and Eve and the serpent. And that led to the first murder with the two brothers, Cain and Abel. And then after that, it started with the line of Seth, their third son, that was spoken about in Genesis. And then we go through the line of Seth, and one of the things that I covered was the age of which they lived was on average about 950 years. So it covered a long timeline. And as we mentioned, Pastor had mentioned also with Methuselah living 969 years. And I looked up some graphs as far as when the ark came to get built and completed to when Methuselah died. It was right before, like a couple of years before. Methuselah had died before the ark was set to sail. And then we have Noah is introduced as I think it was a righteous man that God talked about. And then from there, what we know in Matthew, Jesus had mentioned in Matthew chapter 24, he said, "For in those days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day Noah boarded the ark." So there was a lot of things happening. Sin had gotten so bad, but they were still living this long life. And so they were procreating, and, I tried to do some numbers, and I had shared some numbers with you on what happened during the Exodus when we had the one man that went to Egypt, Jacob, Israel. By the time they left, after 4 generations, there were 600,000 men. So there was an assumption that there was about 2 million people that left after 4 generations. So we understood that populations can actually explode in those generations. And then I took that and divided it by a quarter because he had 2 wives and 2 concubines, their maids, however you want to look at it. So that would leave about 500,000 people if it was 1 man and 1 woman at that time, 4 generations of regular age living, if that makes sense, like 120 years people were living to at that time. So we know that they can populate real fast. Before the flood, the possibility of it being in the billions of people, possibly having more population then than there is now, is very great. In fact, for us, sin has gotten so bad that we, and I don't like to use the term devolve, but we are devolving, because I don't believe in evolution. The only time I've experienced evolution, and I've seen it with my own eyes, so I can't say I believe it, but I do, kind of. But let me explain before Pastor sees this video and throws me out of here. I was in 3rd grade, Miss Butler's class. This is back in elementary school, and they showed me the pictures of the ape and then the lines that go up to standing man. When I was in 3rd grade, they showed me that, and it was 250,000 years evolution. 250,000 from ape to standing walking man. By the time I got into 8th grade, Miss Cohen's class in middle school, they switched it to a million years. So I actually saw evolution happen, of evolution being explained to me. So I hope you guys understand what I said. I'm hoping I'm not, adding the confusion. So yeah, but to say that we are devolving, we actually are. Sin has gotten so bad that if somebody lives to 80 years old, we're cheering for them. And, we can get cancer. That's not a thing of something that's actually getting better. It's actually getting worse. If somebody gets cut here a quarter of an inch, they can die. You'd think if we were evolving, we would have some sort of turtle shell protection or something. I don't know. That's me, just my imagination. But so yeah, and sin has gotten so bad that we understand what Jesus had said, where it's going to be like the time of Noah, because we're waiting on our Savior's return, right? And for the love of many has grown cold. We might be there now. For some of us as believers, we're supposed to love one another. We're supposed to love our neighbor like ourselves, and we're supposed to love God. But sometimes love is not happening. Even amongst the church, there's infighting, and I don't want to say it's possible hatred. There's actual malice towards one another. So not that the love is growing cold, but it's actually getting worse. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole, but so back to Noah. If we understand what Noah went through, he knew people that were living 900 plus years. He lived, I didn't write down the actual years that he lived before the ark, but he saw possibly billions of people during that time. And then he went into the ark, and then those billions died. They were all killed off. And there's a story of many cultures, many different people groups that actually share a flood instance in their culture, in their oral traditions, some of their history. They actually talk about a flood. But if we think about what Noah experienced at the time, he saw total annihilation. I mean, think about that. It's him, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. So 8 people, and two animals of each, and then the count was, I think, 7 of the clean animals that he brought into the ark. So he saw full destruction. And then after Noah, we see the people start to worship themselves. Pastor talked about a technology that was being developed with bricks. And so when they started gathering at Babel, right, God separated the languages so that people couldn't unite in a way and start worshiping themselves even more. But that was what was happening. So God split the languages, and then they split up. And Pastor had given a map of where Japheth went, where Shem went, and where Ham went. But when we understand something about Ham actually was a powerhouse. If we understand about Ham, we know that from him Canaan was born, and Canaan, the land, the Levant area. And then also there were several different people groups of Ham in that area, except for, I think, what we know as Gaza now, which is Japheth. But then Egypt was built, and also there were a group called the Hittites. And there's 2 distinct groups of Hittites. And again, I'm sorry for boring you guys, but I'm just explaining what actually happened. So there was some of Shem, some of Ham, and some of Japheth could have been developing that. And that's in part of Turkey right now, where they actually developed an empire. There was a powerhouse of an empire there. A lot of people don't know about that history, or it's just, mumbled somewhere. Everybody knows about Egypt. But we know that they had bricks. They were making bricks in Babel, right? But now we understand that they actually developed masonry techniques. And there are structures today in Turkey and in Egypt, in areas of the Levant, including portions of Syria, Iraq, and Iran, where they actually have built these buildings that are standing till this day, and there could be like 4,000 years old. Yeah, about 4,000. It should be about that. Like 3,500 years old. So they were a powerhouse. Ham was developing Egypt. Egypt became like the place to be at that time. And same with the northern area of the Hittites. And it took the Babylonians, if you think about it, they were already in that region where where Babylon was, the Tower of Babel. It took them another 1,000 or so years, maybe less, to actually develop, because we understand that Egypt, the powerhouse, the Hittites, the Levant, and then eventually when we go through the empires that came, we have Babylon. Actually, first we have the Assyrians, which is Shemitic, and then we have Babylon, which is Shemitic, and we have the Persian Empire, which is actually part of Shem's line. So we have that, like throughout history, when we start looking at that, we see these powerhouses. And then after that, honestly, if you think about it, Japheth started to grow. And we have the Greek Empire that came in. And one of the things that we understand from the Greek Empire is it's closer to the New Testament. So we understand that Greek language was actually the business language across the world at the time, the known world. So we have the languages divided, empires building, they're building these magnificent, statues and buildings and whatever, and then one of the empires comes and reunites the language. It benefited us because we now have the New Testament was actually primarily written in Greek. So we have a spread of the word that actually covered from Spain all the way in to the Persian area. They were speaking Greek, so that they were actually able to spread the word because each person had their own language, and then they were also having the business language of Greek. And I got to mention something about Noah. I don't want to talk really bad about him, but I'm going to talk bad about him. He was possibly the worst evangelist. If we think about it, he actually was the worst evangelist possible. And I'm saying this because he saw total annihilation. He saw that destruction happen, right? And even though he saw it, he didn't do anything about it. The possibility of him being around by the time Abraham's grandfather was born was very likely, and possibly even his dad, Abram. I'm going to make sure that I call him Abram from this time on. But he was alive. That means he saw his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and his great-great-grandchildren, and so on, start acting like idolaters. And he could have said, hey, this is what happened when all this sin took over the world. God destroyed everything. Yeah, he made a promise he's not going to do it by the flood anymore. But it seems like, and I'm assuming at this point because nothing's written in the Word, but he could have said something to say, hey, worship God. The idolatry doesn't do anything. Worship God. God did this. God brought us in. He restarted humanity because of the sin that was happening. But as we know, he planted that vineyard and I guess started shutting out. Maybe he had PTSD. I don't know. So maybe he brought because it doesn't mention it in the Bible, but he could have brought a little vine, a grapevine with him, and then planted it as soon as things were set. Like his focus was maybe a little bit different. Again, I'm assuming, so just to clarify. So after this, Abram is introduced in Genesis chapter 11. And Pastor had mentioned that he's from the area of Chaldea, and he was probably an idol worshiper. He was, pagan religions. I don't know, it doesn't say that he was sacrificing to them, but honestly, when we understand something about Abram, what does he bring to the table? Who's this guy? Like, there's nothing about him. It doesn't say anything about him at this time. So I started doing some research, like, why Abram? Why? It doesn't make sense that he chose this guy. It doesn't say that he was a man of prominence, right? When you read about some of the kings that were selected, they were head and shoulders above others. In the land at the time, they were actually giants. So there were some really tall people, but it doesn't have anything as far as the features of Abraham. There's nothing about Abram at the time. There's nothing that says Abraham was this awesome guy. Just mentions Abram. And God comes, and I started thinking, like, why him? And then I know that in Job, I know I'm jumping from Abram to Job, but when you think about it, Job falls into the window somewhere between Genesis 11 to like 16, somewhere, possibly. Because of the age that he lived, it actually is very possible that he was around in the time of Abraham, maybe a little before or little after, but around that time. And when we read in Job chapter 1, if you can throw on Job chapter 1, please. In verse 1, it says, there was a man in the country of Uz, named Job. He was a man of complete integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. If we can go to verse 8. And said, the Lord said to Satan, and this is when Satan comes up and he's talking about testing Job. Again, Abram, nothing to the table. We're talking about Job. It says, then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil. Verse 9. Satan answered, Job fears God for nothing. So if I was making that selection, again, I'm not saying I'm God, I'm just saying if I was thinking about making a selection, Job is the perfect candidate. He's the guy, right? He's the one that I would say, hey, he already worships, and if you guys know the story of Job, he sacrificed, right? He sacrificed for his kids just in case they didn't, and he sacrificed just in case to sacrifice it just in case. Like, Job really believed in God, and in verse 10, I think, Joseph, and it says, have you placed the hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. One of the things that we know about Abram, who is going to be renamed Abraham, we know that faith is where the standard is, right? Believing is the standard. When we see that, it says the work of his hands. Job could have considered to be perfect, maybe like a Pharisee, someone of that standard, because he actually, he believed already and he was doing works. But we know that God doesn't make mistakes, right? We know that's an absolute statement. God does not make mistakes. He established his plan before everything happened, and it kind of gives us a blueprint, right? That it was going to be faith that saves us, not works, not anything that we can do. There's nothing that we can bring to the table. Abram is the same. There's nothing he can bring to the table, nothing. So if we can go to Genesis 12, verse 10. So it says, now we're going back to where Pastor kind of left off last week. It says there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was so severe. And go to verse 11. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. And then 13. Please say that you're my sister, so you will go well with me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. So I'm going to make another statement here. It might sound outlandish, but bear with me. There was an internet at the time. I don't know if you guys know this. There was actually internet at the time. I know that because the internet told me there was internet at the time. Back then, they used to have these roads that were traveled, usually with caravans, and a bunch of people would go at one time, together to be safe from raiders. And so when they would travel, there would be groups going and groups coming. And so when they would meet up, and there would be some people of some stature, Abraham had a lot of stuff with him, so they would actually meet up with other people that had a lot of stuff, and they might end up having, tea in a tent or something, or getting rest in somebody else's tent. And there could have been a word spread. The best way I could think about it is, hey, if you go to Egypt, your wife, she looks pretty good. And this is what Pharaoh does, his princes and the people at the gates. They look at the pretty women, and if they're married, they actually kill the husband. So be careful when you go there, because something might happen to you. Now, this is not, in the Bible, but usually the word of mouth was communicated. So I don't know where Abraham picked this up from, but he understood that he asked Sarai to lie because he was afraid. But when we we ask ourselves, why did he go to Egypt at first? Because there was a famine in the land, but God promised him with that great, powerful statement in chapter 12, where God promises the blessings upon him. But there was something in him that maybe had a little doubt of faith, or he didn't trust, so he was going somewhere where it was safe. And when we understand that, again, with faith, sometimes there's trials, and we all go through trials, tribulations. There's always some struggles that we go through, and that's where we get tested, and our faith should become stronger during that time. And this was his first trial, because he already listened to the Lord when he said, leave your father, leave the land, and come to the land of Canaan. So he listened to him then, and he believed him then, but then as soon as things got tough, he went to Egypt. He went to a comfort place. He went to a powerhouse to be under their shelter. And we know also that there's a time for Egypt. There's always a time for Egypt. In the Bible, we know that there's a time for Egypt. And then there's other times when we know there's no time for Egypt. Mistakes are made when they trust in Egypt. And we know this through King Solomon, for example. He forged an alliance, and he married the daughter of Pharaoh so that he can have this, I don't know what you want to call it, like a peace deal, a treaty. So he married the daughter of Pharaoh. She was the one that actually introduced him to some of the worship, the pagan worship, the sacrificing, to just some of the bad stuff where Solomon actually fell. So he had 699 other problems, including this one. So he had 700 problems, right, with wives. Sorry, hon. Just kidding. Yeah. Yes, one is enough. So Solomon, he was given wisdom beyond understanding. One of the smartest men ever recorded here and possibly ever existed, because God gave him that wisdom. And Solomon he turned away from the Lord right away. We have King Hosea. When the kingdom split after Solomon's son was not able to keep the kingdom together, the northern kingdom, which was Israel or Samaria, and then the southern kingdom, which was Judah, he sent envoys to Pharaoh so that he can form an alliance against the Assyrians. And we know that failed, and Assyria finally took over the northern tribes of 10, the northern kingdom, and they were actually dispersed. It was some of the cruelest people on the face of the planet were the Assyrians. And then we look at King Hezekiah, and he sought military aid against the Assyrians when Sennacherib was knocking at the door. And he didn't, I don't want to say he didn't trust God, because Hezekiah was equivalent to David from what we read and understand about him, but he still tried to think earthly. He didn't think spiritually. He didn't think that God would protect him. So he tried to make an alliance. And Isaiah told him, what are you doing? Egypt is nothing. And so he broke apart that treaty and moved on. And then King Zedekiah, and he was the last king, he rebelled against Babylon. This is when Israel, the northern kingdom, was already destroyed. And so he formed an alliance with them. But at that point, we know that the Babylonian Empire was so powerful, they destroyed the Egyptian protection and then finally took over the southern kingdom and then had the dispersion go to Babylon. And then burned the temple, destroyed it all, like Jerusalem was leveled. And then we know that there's a couple of times for Egypt that's mentioned here. One, by force, right, is to save Israel, the people, the person, and the family line, and the other one to save the Savior. In Genesis 37, we know that the son of Jacob, Israel, was sold into slavery by his brothers and was taken to Egypt. So there was a time for them to go to Egypt, and that's God had it planned, even though it was done under really bad circumstances. But it was a good time to go to Egypt so that it can save Israel, and then they can actually build over there and then come back to the promised land. And then in Matthew 2, Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, Mary's husband, he had an angel tell him, hey, we have Herod, he's killing off the kids, the young boys, flee, go to Egypt. So this time we actually have the word saying, hey, go to Egypt. And we know that Joseph, he picked up and left, took Mary and Jesus, and they went to Egypt. And they came back later on. So I know sometimes that you can have doubt and still have faith. And I'm just going to share a quick verse. Sorry, this was in my mind earlier. And this is when the disciples were trying to cast out a demon-possessed boy, but they couldn't do it. And they were, there's more detail into this. There's a message in this just by itself. And the father was just saddened because the disciples couldn't do it, so they brought him to Jesus. And then Jesus said to him, if you can't, and this is in verse 23, everything is possible to the one who believes. And immediately the father of the boy cried out, I do believe, help my unbelief. So we know that we can struggle with faith even when we believe. We see that Abraham actually had this struggle because he fled to Egypt instead of trusting in what God had told him. Verse 14. So when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. 15. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, so the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. And 16, he treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. So we see that now we got to see a little bit of Abram's character. He had a little fib, just a little lie. And in this case, honestly, it was a half-truth because he told them that she's his sister. Technically, Sarai was his sister. So he didn't fully lie, but he told the truth, but he didn't say that she was also my wife. So that lie was one of the first things that we see with the character of Abram. And again, I know that we can take the good test, and pastors talked about it, and if I say I haven't lied, I'm telling you right now, I'm lying when I say I haven't lied. So we see that just to say, okay, his faith is still shaken just a little bit. He's still questioning his faith because he's trying to figure out a way to protect himself fleshly. Not by what God has said, I will bless you. He's not relying on those words that God had mentioned in the previous chapter. He's actually thinking, how am I going to do this? Sometimes, we prepare, and sometimes I don't want to say we're preppers, but sometimes we prepare so much that we hide things over. We're thinking fleshly instead of spiritually, knowing that what Pastor's been sharing about the disciples' prayer, where we pray every day for the Lord to give us our daily bread. But sometimes we think, we might not get it, so I got to prepare. I'm guilty of that, just saying. So I'm not knocking anybody. And if you think I'm knocking, I'm one of those. So just understand that. Verse 17, Joseph, please. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. 18. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife?" 19. "Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her as my wife? Now here is your wife, take her and go." And then verse 20. Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him and sent him away with his wife and all he had. So we know, right, that Pharaoh took good care of him when Sarai was his sister. And he gave him, I don't want to call it a dowry, but it could have been something because he ended up with a lot. When he was in Egypt, he was well taken care of. But at the same time, Pharaoh took Sarai as wife. And again, remember, she's old. So he's not taking her to have children because she's beyond childbearing age, right? Because they weren't able to have children. But she was still good looking enough, based on the internet information that he got on the caravans, to say, okay, so he's going to just take her and keep her as a wife, concubine, whatever you want to think about it. But God had to intervene at that time because the fleshly ideas that were happening were not based on what he had said, God had said to Abram on how he was going to take care of it. And Sarai was going to be the one to bring the promised child. So after that, when we read here, then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. So he built up all these riches, right? And when he left, those orders, I'm assuming, because it doesn't say so, he says, don't let him turn back. If he does. So when we think about what he didn't do in trusting God at that time, he literally put, if you think about it, the promises to him, the promises to Sarai, and he put everyone that was under his roof, and at this point, I'm going to get back to it, Lot also, he put everyone in danger because Pharaoh could have just really gotten angry and just killed them all and took everything that he had. But he sent them away. He said, just go and get out of here. With the plague, I don't know what the plagues were, it's not mentioned, but it's almost like a pre-Exodus, where he says, take your stuff and go, and he went in, maybe having less because there was a famine in the land, and when he's leaving with excess. So it was almost like an Exodus that we see in the book of Exodus when the Israelites were actually leaving. So if we can go to chapter 13, Joseph. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he, his wife, and all he had, and Lot with him. 2. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. 3. He went by stages to the Negev, to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent was formerly been. So he went back to where he was, and he went by stages. So I don't know, maybe he's catching his breath. He's just like, okay, this just happened, so I'm going back. And assuming he's processing what had happened. And we see that, go to verse 4. It says, and the site where he had built the altar, Abram called on the name of the Lord. So he goes back to where he was before, when the famine had taken, right? And he decided fleshly, hey, I got to take care of myself. There's something wrong here. I know God said this, but things are so bad, I got to get out of here. So he goes, he does the Egypt trip, lies, gets kicked out of Egypt because of what he had done. And so he comes back and, at this point, he goes back to where he was initially, and he called on the name of the Lord. He started praying. Nowhere from that journey from the famine start to Egypt do we see that he called on the name of the Lord. He was relying on himself, his flesh. Verse 5, Joseph. So he says now, Lot, this guy keeps popping up in the story, Lot, says, now Lot was traveling with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents. So again, I'm assuming, right, that Lot also got some payback payoff from Egypt. And they were blessed in such abundance, even Lot was like loaded at this time. And 6, it says, but the land was unable to support them as long as so they stayed together, for they had so many possessions that they could not stay together. And then 7. And there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At the time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land. And the parentheses, by the way, they mean that this is Moses that's writing this story, so he just added that for context. So it's Lot, Abram, they're loaded, they got so many animals, and then there was also other people over there, so there could have been contention with those people as well. And there was contention between Abram and Lot and his people, because they've established so much wealth. And honestly, you could see that Lot was also blessed because he was hanging out with Abram. And with Lot, I'm hoping Pastor shares that message if we have to share it, or maybe Mark will do it, because Lot has a bad backstory. It's terrible. I don't want to it's yucky. But we know that he had 2 sons with his daughters, and again, it's gross, so sorry. But his sons actually set up the cities of Moab and Ammon. And we know that Ammon, or Ben-Ami was his son's name, is actually the city that's still established till this day. It's the capital of Jordan, in that same area, the kingdom of Jordan. And Moab, we know, is pagan, but they're still part of Shem, and same with Ammon. And we know that in Jesus' line, his lineage, in Matthew 1, it actually explains, we know that Ruth is involved in that. Ruth was a Moabite. But she was from the descendants of Shem through Lot. So we know that in the lineage, Ruth, a Moabite, actually played a role. So they decided to part ways, right? So let's go to 8. So Abram says, okay, we're gonna make this deal. Like, you go. If you go one way, I'll go another, right? It's written here. It says, so Abram said to Lot, please, let's not have quarreling between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relatives. 9. Isn't the whole land before you? Separate from me, and if you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. 10. And Lot looked out and saw the entire plain of the Jordan as far as Zoar, and it was watered everywhere, like the Lord's garden in the land of Egypt. And again, back to the parentheses, this is Moses adding context. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot looked and he saw the land, and he was like, that looks good. And we go back to what we talked about in the garden initially, and the temptations of Jesus as well. And in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, it says, for everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of one's possession is not from the Father, but from the world. Lot could have been missing something. And if you guys recall, Pastor had shared that they left a city called Haran when they were coming into the land of Canaan. And Haran was also the name of Lot's dad. So he could have been thinking, I miss those good old days. A nice area that's lush and beautiful, and maybe a big city. If you go to verse 11, Joseph. So Lot chose the entire plain of Jordan for himself, and Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other in 12. And Abram lived in the land of Canaan, but Lot lived in the cities on the plain and set up his tent near Sodom. So a lot of possessions, when you have those kind of possessions back then, because the cities were encircled, walled, there's no way you're going to take all your flocks and everything that you have with you. So you're going to set up a tent, you're going to have an area outside of the city, and all your possessions and everything's going to be there, and you're going to hang out there. And if we look forward a little bit in the story here, Lot actually ended up in a house in the city of Sodom or Gomorrah, I forgot which one. And he was also a man of some prominence because he was actually a person at the gate as well. So he might have been trying to relive what he was experiencing in Haran, and now he's a man of some prominence in the cities. So his eyes took him from what he can see, everything that was over there, and then he just went to a city where he felt comfortable. And one of the things, Lamech, I think, was the one that lived in a city right after Cain and Abel. It was the grandson of Cain. I'm trying to remember. Sorry, I should have prepped better on that one. And he ended up in the city. So every time we have a city, right, and I know that we were meant to live separately, but together. We were supposed to gather together. But in those times, a city was a place of sin. It was a place where you can indulge in anything, kind of like a city nowadays. So anything that your heart desired, you can get. Same with those cities then. Remember, there's nothing new under the sun. Sin is sin, and it's always been there. There's nothing new that surprises us now. It shouldn't, because it's always been there. So Lot goes to this area because, hey, he can live it up in a city, like maybe he was living in Haran with a status, and he had all these possessions. So he goes over there. So after their separation, 13, it says, and this is the added part, now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning immensely against the Lord. There's going to be more to the story in a couple of chapters. I don't want to jump the gun. But everyone knows Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm assuming you do. So, assuming, but some people don't. So after Lot had separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, look from this place where you are. Look north, south, east, west. For I will give you and your offspring forever the land that you see. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. 17. Get up and walk around the land through its length and width, for I will give it to you. So Abram is told to go walk around, take a look. Everything that you see, north, south, east, west, is yours. It's going to belong to your offspring. All of it. It's yours. His name is still Abram. Exalted father. Doesn't have a kid yet. No son. He's going to be changed. His name is going to be changed to Abraham. Is going to be a father of nations or multitudes. No son. No children. And Lot's gone. So he's thinking, he was the closest thing I had to an heir. I have nothing now. So he's back to faith. He's back to kind of like a clean slate, saying, okay, if God says it, I'm going to do it. So he listens to God, and he goes and walks the land. And then 18. And there was a famine in the land, so Abram, 18, you got me, Joseph. No problem. I forgive you. Everyone's looking. No pressure. No pressure. So Abram moved his tent and went to live near the oaks of Mamre at Hebron, where he had built an altar to the Lord. So Pastor had mentioned, I think last week, when Abram left in Genesis 12:5, and he went to the oak of Moreh, and there was pagan worship in that area, and he had built an altar to the Lord there. And this is before the Egyptian trip. And usually, if there's oaks or something like that, and that's where They sacrificed to their pagan beliefs. And I think there was a guy actually named Morate, and they were called the Morites at the time. And he does something similar here, where Abram moved to the oaks of Mamre at Hebron. So when we read something like this, we know that there's pagan worship happening at those trees, and they're sacrificing who knows what. I mean, it could be people, animals, whatever, but it's their pagan belief. But Abram built an altar to the Lord. This time, when I actually read those words, where he built an altar to the Lord, it kind of sets a different tone when we read it this time compared to when he goes the first time where he built an altar to the Lord when he's in the land of Canaan. This time, there's a little bit of difference to it. There's like and I have to be very careful when I say we can't use feelings. Feelings aren't always the best thing to use as a judge of a situation. So when we read the word, sometimes there's emotions that are explained. Like when Jesus entered Jerusalem and he wept over it, you can feel the sadness that he's feeling. You know, when he's crying out, "O Jerusalem, O Jerusalem." You can feel that sadness by reading it and understanding that he was actually, in his heart, there was heavy sadness over what they had become, where they had deviated so far from the original message. Also, another time when we actually have an explanation of emotions, we have Joseph, who was sold by his brothers, and you can actually feel the anguish that he's going through when you read it. It's actually a really sad story. He's going through and begging and pleading for his brothers not to sell him. I mean, think about that. You have your family members, your brothers are selling you to a person, and he's begging and pleading his anguish. When we read that in Genesis, I forgot, I think chapter 39. I don't want to jump the gun again. If you guys are reading ahead, fantastic. You can feel the sadness that's in him, begging and pleading not to be sold by his own brothers. And then there's other times when we can get the emotion without the words actually being spoken. And we kind of see this when we have Jesus go back and forth, and normally with Jesus it wasn't a back and forth, it was just straight truth. And they tried to throw stuff back at him, but it didn't work. With the Pharisees and the scribes, and also when he was speaking with Nicodemus, you can feel the sadness in the tone of the words that Jesus was feeling pity for them. You know, it doesn't say it, but you can feel the pity that he has. It's like, why don't you see what I'm telling you? I'm right here. And they don't see it. They're ignoring it. It's like they're talking to him with their eyes closed, their ears plugged up. And you can feel that pity that he has as he's speaking to these people, but it's not explaining the emotion. And there's another time in Genesis 37 where Joseph, which caused the sell-off by his brothers, Joseph shares his dream with his brothers, and they get angry at him, and Jacob even chastises him, like, what? I'm going to bow down to you, and your mom's going to bow down, and your brother's going to bow down to you? And in verse 11, it says, his brothers were jealous, but his father kept the matter in mind. And it's like, it's just some, a small sentence where Jacob kept the matter in mind. So here Joseph is saying, I had this dream and all these things are going to happen. And Jacob even chastised him, but he's processing it. In that tone, you understand, because Jacob earlier, when he was fleeing from Esau, right, he actually had a vision of a stairway that was going up. And he saw people going up and down. So he knows there's something spiritual. So when you read that line, it's just a basic line. He kept the matter in mind. But when you understand, Jacob's like, there's something there, but I can't quite grasp it. But I'm just going to think about it, and I'm going to ponder it for a little bit. So when I say there's a tone in the sentence, right, where he built an altar to the Lord. So he goes back, and this time it sets a different tone. I think at this point, I want to say his faith is established. I think this time it has more meaning, even though it's the same sentence as it was a couple of verses back, but I think this time he really meant it. His faith was fortified. And if we can understand that, again, we can have doubts, we can believe, but we can still have doubts. And this time, I think he actually established the faith from what Pastor had shared with Romans chapter 4 and 3. It says, what does the scripture say about Abraham? It says, Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him for righteousness. I think that Genesis 13 sets the faith this time. It's like when Pastor says, you get baptized, you got wet, but then you get baptized. So it was before belief. So Abraham believed. He left his land, came to Canaan, still believing. First trial, bailed, and then realized, I shouldn't have bailed. He comes back, and this time I think it's established. This is where Abraham sets his faith. And at this point, keep in mind, no children, no lot, no heir, just faith. That's it for this evening. For everybody online, thanks for joining us.